times like the coronavirus pandemic,
unintended misinformation
follows a predetermined direction.
That's what draws the viewers.
Audiences who don't know better.
And that's really important.
My name is Chris.
I'm Trinity.
I'm Rachel.
I'm Megan.
This is the second episode of Sonder, the first formal podcast about current events and social issues. Here we promote student-led discussions, civil discourse, and critical thinking. This is a safe and neutral space, and all opinions are welcome. We are just here to sit and discuss, cool topics, theories, prominent events, and really just anything. So for our second episode, we will be discussing misinformation and disinformation. So Trinity, can you please kick us off with, the definitions between these two terms? Because they can often be, obviously.
Yeah, they're often used together.
Yes,
or
exactly.
Interchangeably. So think of disinformation as a subset of misinformation. Misinformation is information that is communicated, that is false or inaccurate. In order to communicate misinformation, you don't necessarily have the intention to deceive. For example, you could just not know about what you're talking about, or you don't have complete or perfect information, or you just have confirmation bias. On the other hand, disinformation is spreading false or inaccurate information that was communicated with the intention to deceive somebody else. For example, it's generally used to forward an agenda, so like propaganda. It's deliberately false and inaccurate, but people do it with the intention of deceiving people.
Yeah, so do you guys have any examples of misinformation or disinformation, so I think our listeners can easily understand this topic more?
An example of misinformation, there's a lot of misinformation going around about vaccines. This is present through perhaps discussions and ideas that are spread about vaccines and whether they should be used or not. A lot of the time, not all of this information is correct and can lead to some unintended misinformation towards audiences who don't know better.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with this. Rachel, do you want to just give us an example of disinformation?
I think disinformation also ties in with something called deliberate bias.
Yes.
And deliberate bias is when someone intentionally changes data in order to change the result of an experiment or a study, right? So this information gathered is changed so that it follows a predetermined direction, which plays into the part of bias and also in disinformation, because for example with propaganda, which Trinity said, they change what they actually think just to follow to follow the result that they want to achieve.
So like a form of confirmation bias.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess deliberate bias obviously falls under disinformation, and I guess that's kind of a prominent thing we see now in our society regarding so many things. For example, the news, right?
Yeah, I agree.
Because everything is very politicalized now. Yes, that's so the news that we see and we hear is very biased, and it can often peddle kind of certain
backward in some intention.
Yeah, certain kind of viewpoints, and that's what draws the viewers. So they continue to do that, and actually encourages this cycle that's unhealthy for society.
Yeah, but there are also times when obviously misinformation and disinformation are both bad things because they can basically lead to inaccurate information, and when people have inaccurate information about something, that would affect how they decide to
society's perception.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's really important, especially in times like the coronavirus pandemic, when
definitely.
When for example, there's the thing about a pill. It's a drug that's used to treat some illness that people say is a cure for coronavirus, but that has been proven to not be true.
So misinformation.
Yeah, so I think the coronavirus is a great example, right? Because because we trust different news sources, we get our information from different places, and so we have different information.
Yeah.
And that's why, for example, just giving an example, in the US, it's really hard to control this situation because everyone
so
gets
much
their
fake news going
information
around.
from somewhere different.
Yeah.
And I think it's plausible to tie this, to, let's, for example, say China, right, where they have, relatively the same information, the same sources, and in that case, when there is a pandemic, that would be more beneficial to
Everyone
society.
has the same perception
Yes.
of what's going on.
Even though, and again, that could be misinformation. It's still this kind of unity of thought that can sometimes drive progress.
What I think is also important to look at is the receiver's end. So if you see some information or maybe some data online, I think it's also important to fact check and to see because there is so much misinformation going around, it's important that when you receive a piece of information to do your own research and to do your own fact checking to see whether or not it's accurate.
Yeah.
And to identify the purpose of each source, because a lot of the times, a lot of the things we see are manipulated data or changed in a way to make you think
Worded
a certain way.
especially.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's really important to understand, is it to persuade or to inform? And that way you can analyze a source yourself with critically and see whether or not it's trustworthy or whether or not you should be believing it.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the concept of deliberate bias that Rachel mentioned. A case study that we looked into was the case of Clint Lawrence, who was, I believe, a U.S. general or a
Lieutenant,
a platoon leader, who served in Afghanistan
yeah.
and was essentially convicted of war crimes, of murder. And after he went into jail, Fox News basically picked up on this story and turned it into a whole, the judicial system is kind of corrupted and being unfair to these people who serve our country and protect us. And they kept peddling this misinformation. However, this actually wasn't the case, and when they went to interview the actual soldiers in his platoon, they actually said that this actually wasn't the case. So that's and without that video, we would never know that actually wasn't the case, and Fox News viewers would therefore have a kind of skewed perception of what actually happened.
Yeah.
And this happens so much, and we can be so unaware of this.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the major issues, is that we don't know when this happens and how often
And
this
it's
happens.
also a bit of a rabbit hole. Once you believe that something is true, you go off and you think of your own ideas. People also naturally make their own assumptions. They make their own judgments based on the information that they receive and that they hear. So for example, the example that you used, once someone had heard of the false information that was given, they might come with their own ideas, spread their own ideas, which
Exactly.
falls into a rabbit hole because
Polarization.
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
polarization, because the original idea was not correct.
Yeah, and then when you see someone else that's, for example, a liberal, right, who has
Oh
a completely different news source, there's no common ground for you guys to even discuss. There's no middle ground because
The beliefs are completely separate.
exactly, and everything becomes just so to the polarized, and to the point where literally everyone is an extremist and
Yeah.
can't openly discuss it because of how sensitive it is.
I think an issue that we've been discussing is how important media is in the spread of information, and therefore how how significant media is in the spread of misinformation. And I personally like to think that most medias, it's probably not true, but most medias generally try to maintain, as the most loyal news sources try to maintain more centered. But just because of the nature of media, they have to appeal to a wide audience. And so a lot of times misinformation or disinformation often catches more eyes than true information.
Yeah.
For example, it's a less socially prominent issue. But I think we all know of the alpha male theory about how there are alpha and beta males in society. Like how alpha males are supposed to be like strong-willed and passionate, and how beta people are supposed to be more soft-hearted and gentle and loyal and such. This theory came from a book published in 1968 called The Wolf, Ecology and Behavior of an Endangered Species. Essentially, it was a really acclaimed or a really good naturalist and biologist in the US who studied wolves for 26 summers and observed their interactions. And he found that a lot of the wolves just listened to this dominant pair, and he called this pair the alpha, and then he published a book on it, and the media loved it, because it's kind of like social science. You can apply it to the things you can see, and so this whole alpha and beta thing became something that everybody knows. But then in 1999, this biologist called David Meck, he published another paper that essentially disproved and debunked his own theory. This was because he went and did some more research in hopes of trying to validate or confirm his findings, and he just found that the reason the wolves listened to the so-called dominant pair was not because they were like physically fitter or they were stronger.
Yeah.
Or because he was the quote-unquote alpha, but it was just because he was the dad. He was the breeding pair. So, like you listen to your parents not because they're like physically stronger than you, but just because they're your parents. But he wrote another paper to try to publish it, but then the media kind of just ignored it because the previous misinformation, with the whole thing about the alpha theory, it was just so attractive to other people. So
it fits in and it makes sense to people.
Yeah, it makes sense to people, even if it's not true or not scientifically founded. So
just building off what you said, I read this thing actually from like an SAT passage about how a lot of kind of these scientific studies, when they reach a conclusion that isn't really like pointing towards one direction, or when they have a conclusion after they've tested the whole experiment that doesn't really give us any information, that tends to not be published in any major kind of news outlets. And I think that's actually a major issue, because then we strive, then it defeats the purpose of experiments, right? Because
and news.
Exactly, and news, because when we have an hypothesis, we kind of just say, okay, we're going to go through this experiment to get this result so we can publish it and make money. That's the incentive. And the incentive isn't, okay, we're going to, just like have research out there.
It's not for the pursuit of truth anymore. It's just for the pursuit of finding definite answers.
Yeah.
But the thing is, even if there are answers, and a lot of the times there isn't just one answer, we need a lot of time to be able to replicate our research. So for example,
I see your point there.
Yeah, there's this point about time. Even if, how do we determine whether things are quote unquote scientifically accurate or inaccurate? You need time, you need other people to be able to replicate your research. But we just want this information so quickly, and that's just, a lot of times that's just not achievable. So it's easy to spread misinformation.
Or information that's not completely validated.
And from adding on to what you guys both said, like, it's gone to the point where people have to strive to get really extreme results. For example, like results that are sort of like, there's like sort of a pattern but not really. People don't publish that because it's just not interesting enough. So people strive to make things more interesting, therefore it just adds to the polarization of our society. And
everyone aims to be in the headlines, right?
Yeah.
To be in the headlines, you've got to be eye-catching, and viewers have to want to click on your article.
Yeah. But that could be leading towards disinformation, because there is a sort of, the intentions aren't to educate the reader anymore. The intention is to
I completely agree with you, right? This is what
So the
but
intention is no longer to educate.
exactly. But at the end of the day, the information that they're spreading is misinformation, and readers become misinformed.
Yeah.
Even though they're, again, what we said, deliberate bias and their intentions.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you guys so much for tuning into our podcast today. My name is Chris.
I'm Trinity.
I'm Rachel.
I'm Megan.
Stay tuned for next week's podcast, and we will see you then. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.